Thanks so much for joining us today on Feelin Good, sponsored by Warren County Community Services. I'm your host, Shelly Abrams, and today, as you can probably see, we are not in the studio, but we are at Miami University Middletown campus for the 50th anniversary commemoration of the Paris Peace Accords as they pertain to the Vietnam War. And I know that normally our topics are feeling good kind of topics. Today we're feeling good because we are recognizing the veterans that served and have served throughout our country's history, and more specifically today, the Vietnam War period and the Paris Peace Accords. And today my guest is a veteran who has served throughout his life in many ways, Bob Viney. And we are here to talk to Bob about how his service began as a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Bob, thanks for joining us today on this rather poignant day, right?
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, indeed. Well, here we are, January 27th, 1973, and you're joining forces with your submarine shipmates. Tell us a little bit about what that period of your life was like, if you would.
Well, I actually was in the Vietnam War zone on the submarine in the summer of 1972. And we were in the area which was being mined by the U.S. In Haiphong Harbor and Hainan to try to force the North Vietnamese to agree to peace terms that were in their fourth year of negotiation. And the war was really going in their favor. So they weren't, and they, of course, would see the opposition marches and so forth that were taking place in the U.S. So they didn't really have a strong incentive to give much. And the U.S. was asking for a ceasefire, a withdrawal period, and then negotiations, peaceful negotiations of the future of North and South Vietnam. So President Nixon decided that a little increase in military activity might help as an incentive to negotiate peace. So in May of 1972, he began a mining operation in North Vietnam, and then the bombing was to take out the alternate overland supply routes. The goal being to try to force North Vietnam to the peace table because of lack of supplies. Submarines were sent into the war zone to monitor the surface ship shipping traffic that was going in and out, and to see if we could get close enough to see ships through the periscope and actually identify the ship name, the nationality, and if we could, to see what kind of cargo was on the ship. But you could also tell from how it was riding in the water as to whether it was heavily loaded or lightly loaded. So all of that was part of our intelligence gathering mission. I didn't, of course, all we knew was we were ordered to go in and support this operation. We didn't really, because we had been on a Westpac patrol doing several missions up until that time. and we didn't know about the peace negotiations and what was taking place. We didn't see the news. But it turns out that was an important part of eventually getting North Vietnam to agree to a final peace settlement, the Paris Peace Accords, in January of 1973, just a few months later.
Interesting how you go from, and would you explain to our audience what the Westpac is? You mentioned that.
Yeah, Westpac is the terminology for being deployed from your home base, which ours was in Honolulu, but also submarines from San Diego made Westpacs. And it just means you were deployed away from home for 6-7 months into the Western Pacific.
Okay.
That's what Westpac stands for.
Okay.
So we were detached from our normal chain of command, and we were part of the 7th Fleet, which was the Western Pacific chain of command. And so we were under their orders for 7 months, away from home, very little communication with the outside world, family, etc. And we did 3 special operations missions, 3 very different special operations missions during that period. The third one being the about 3 weeks that we spent in the waters of North Vietnam, which not a great place for a submarine that's 330 feet long to be, where the water's only about 450 feet deep. It didn't give you a lot of room before you might have hit the bottom. And the biggest danger to us really was running into a surface ship when we were at periscope depth, or when we were running to go from ship contact to ship contact. We would be very close to the bottom, running at very high speed. And but we knew that we were still making, because of the sail being close to the surface, we were still making like a little wave on the surface. So it wasn't exactly like being undetected.
Interesting. I would say, excuse me, that I was at Miami University on the Oxford campus during this period of time, 1969 through 1973, graduating in June. And very often, as we're planning now for our 50th class reunion at Miami in June, I was looking through some Miami scrapbooks and photos of our college life. And my experience of those years was so different from your perspective during those years, certainly. And I know that at one time, President Shriver was the president of our university. He said that 1969 through 1973 was the most tumultuous period of time at Miami, for sure, and probably campuses and other schools from coast to coast in the U.S., just because there was so many different perspectives of the war, and even though we saw the news, and you said you didn't often see the news, very often we did not know quite what to think, because we saw people that we knew either being drafted or signing up to serve, or the lottery. I remember when the lottery came into play, and students just packing up. And I'll never forget them just walking across East Quad, where I lived, and they knew that their number had been drawn, and they were leaving school in 1969 to go into service in Vietnam. So with that being said, here we are 50 years later and commemorating the Paris Peace Accords, and also paying special attention to the veterans that served during that period of time. It's a very interesting comparison, I would say, 50 years ago, and now here we are. All the while appreciating what veterans have done to defend our freedoms and our democracy. And yet you've told me stories when you got out of the Navy, and I think our audience would be interested in knowing about what the recommendation was for you wearing your uniform in public.
Well, there was never really a formal recommendation, but, you know, we learned very quickly during, I was at the Naval Academy 66 through 70.
Okay.
So that included the very tumultuous year of 1968, when there were a lot of riots taking place across the country. And we avoided wearing our uniform out in public when we could. When I was on active duty, I was at school, nuclear power school, submarine school, for the first year and a half. So kind of on isolated areas. But even around Pearl Harbor, living off base in the civilian community, we didn't wear our uniform except to and from the base. It was not a period of time when military service was as cherished or recognized as important to the country as it is today, which is great to see. But the building of the Vietnam Memorial in a decade later in the 80s was really the beginning of public recognition that when citizens are called to service by the country, their job or their ability as a citizen to oppose government policy kind of ends. You take the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution and the government of the United States. The Constitution enables the Congress to set a military, staff a military, and put the military in action as they see necessary to defend the country. I remember a quote that we used often in the 60s and 70s was, "My country, may she always be right, but right or wrong, my country." And I remember a classmate of my dad's who was a long-serving POW, and he was asked on an interview in North Vietnam whether he supported the government policy of the U.S. Mm-hmm. And he'd been in prison for years at this time. And his answer was, "I have no idea. I've been in prison for years. I have no idea what the policy of the current government is. Whatever it is, I support it." And he was tortured after that for that answer, because, of course, they wanted him to say, "No, I don't support it. It's wrong." That's what they were trying to get all the POWs to say. So that it seems so distant, those thoughts, that commitment to service, seems so distant sometimes from where we are today, where you have senators and representatives who oppose the election, certifying the election of a president without any due process or any factual evidence being presented in court that validated the rumors. Just based on rumors, conspiracy theories, and unfounded statements, they took action against the government. That's, to me, that's just unfathomable. We have ways established in the Constitution where we can protest against the government if we think they're taking wrong actions. But if we're going to think about the serious step of overturning a government, shouldn't you have some proof? If you're just relying on what you heard on the radio or read on Facebook, then are you any different than being a victim of rumor and propaganda? Then, we saw the Russians and the Germans in the Cold War and World War II being subjected to propaganda that they couldn't verify as true. We have ways of verifying the truth. And if we take action where we haven't bothered to verify the truth or refuse to accept the truth when it's presented, our country's in big trouble.
Well, that's a segue into something that's more local here in Southwest Ohio that I know you're involved with, and that's the Voice of America and the Voice of America Museum. You want to share a little bit about some future plans that you as a veteran or you as an informed citizen are going to be involved?
Well, the teaching of history is obviously so important to securing the future of our democracy and our freedoms and our liberties, that a group of veterans, as you said, are getting together and working on building a Cold War memorial to the veterans in the area, Cincinnati, Dayton area, that were involved in protecting the country during the Cold War. And that war, while the Vietnam War went on for, 8 years, maybe 10 years, the Cold War went on for 50. And we were able to win the Cold War without any military conflict at all. The people that played a major part in that were the people that were always on station, the people that served in Europe on the battleground or the border between the free world and the communist Iron Curtain back in the 60s. The people like myself that served in the submarine force and did very important intelligence gathering information because we could get very close to Russia in those days without being detected. So we have pieces of the USS Cincinnati, which was a fast attack submarine that operated for 20 years during the Cold War and helped keep us free and helped us win. And we're looking to use a full-size replica of that submarine with some real pieces that we have, and use it as an educational attraction. And we're hoping it's going to be on the ground of the Voice of America Center in Westchester, which is the place where all the broadcasts that were done during the Cold War and the Vietnam and the World War II were actually done around the world, broadcasting around the world in multiple languages. But the grounds where we have the Voice of America Museum and the soccer fields and Liberty Way and all of that was covered with broadcast towers. And Westchester was the technology center where all those broadcasts were made for all those years that went into the countries behind the Iron Curtain to tell them the truth, to counteract the propaganda that they were bombarded with every day, and to tell them about countries where there was freedom and liberty versus where they were living. And so we want to memorialize that role that this area played in that contest, both those who served in any aspect of the military and those who helped the Voice of America. So it's going to talk about all the STEM-related technologies that are part of both submarine operations and nuclear power operations and Voice of America broadcast technology, and educate kids through interactive kiosks about how all of that worked, and hopefully inspire more kids in our country to be involved in science, technology, engineering, and math, but also be more informed about the importance of what it means to protect our liberty and our democracy, that they are not free, that living in a democracy is not just about your rights, it's also about your obligations, your responsibilities. And democracy, I think, requires citizens who serve the country and are not just looking to be served by the country.
Well, let me thank you for your service, and I'm looking forward to hearing the comments of the commemoration, the speakers that are on the program today here at Miami and Middletown, and I appreciate you sharing some of these memories from the past, commemorating the anniversary of January 27th, 1973, and looking to the future for service to country. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Bye for now.
My name is Patrick Jump. I'm a United States Marine Corps veteran and the Regional Veterans Coordinator for Miami University. Odd thing about the national anthem, at least in my opinion, maybe many for you. I can still remember the day and the moment that I heard it for the first time after returning back to American soil. And it kind of brought a tear to my eye at that time, and thinking of it now, it does as well. So thank you for joining us today. We appreciate the staff, faculty, students, community members, and veterans in attendance today. At Miami University, we serve close to 400 veteran and military affiliated students and families. Here at the regional campuses, we serve over 180 of those students. Today's event is a collaboration of our regional history department, public programming, and the regional veteran centers as part of our Passport for Programming. We also offer a special thank you to the Springboro Air Force JROTC and Lieutenant Colonel Todd Barrier for serving as our color guard today. Tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, where the United States, South Vietnam, Viet Cong, and North Vietnam formally signed an agreement ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. Different organizations, embassies, and foundations are commemorating the event with panels, ceremonies, etc. And we wanted to join them today with our own event, not only to commemorate the signing of the agreement, but to take a moment and recognize the veterans who served the Vietnam War. So I got to the note where it says, Patrick, if you'd like to provide thoughts of your own. So my father served, I was telling Aries, our guest speaker, my father served from 66 to 69 in the United States Marine Corps. Now you know why I joined the Marine Corps. And he was in the Quang Tri province of Vietnam with 3rd Amphibious Tractor Battalion at that time. He told me, after he came home, they flew into Hawaii and they changed into civilian clothing and then proceeded on to Los Angeles to arrive at an airport. The reason they did that is so that they weren't harassed, attacked, or spit on coming home. It's a very different feeling than I had coming home. I came home to like parades and families waiting and celebrations and clapping. And it always brings me back, and I've mentioned this before, if you've ever heard me talk about the thank you for your service. And the generation of people that served in Vietnam are the reason that history didn't repeat itself when I came home. So the United States civilian population has never really apologized to the Vietnam veterans for the way that they were treated when they came home. So I'd be happy for it to start with me and say thank you for your service and for what you did. I'm going to leave it at that. So at this time, we'd like to welcome our first guest speaker to the podium, Dr. Michael Carafello, who's a professor of history at Miami University Regionals. Where'd he go? There he is.
Thank you, Patrick. Today, we gather with deep respect and a profound sense of gratitude to recognize those who valiantly served this nation during the Vietnam War. We've been told over and over again that Vietnam was unlike any American conflict that preceded it. Countless articles have been written, books published, and speeches delivered proclaiming as much. And I suppose there's a fair amount of truth in that. But I am here to tell you that America's involvement in Southeast Asia holds something very much in common with the wars before it. Millions of America's finest men and women answered the call of their nation, including many who doubted the wisdom of that call, and served this country honorably, faithfully, and courageously. Many paid a high price in body, mind, and spirit, and over 50,000 paid the ultimate price. Even if, in many respects, their nation's policymakers failed them, they did not fail their nation. And for that, we justly honor them today. When we teach history, American history, and we recount America's wars, we move from the American Revolution to the War of 1812, to the Mexican War, to the Civil War, to the Spanish-American War. And there's a lot of information, a lot of statistics, a lot of things to recount. But in the case of Vietnam, these numbers represent something very special, very precious. A statistic is sometimes worth 1,000 words. It paints a picture. And so now a few numbers from Vietnam, America's commitment. And if we can, think of the precious lives behind these numbers. 2,709,918 Americans served in Vietnam. 58,148 Americans were killed in Vietnam. 75,000 were severely disabled. 23,214 were 100% disabled. Of those killed, 61% were younger than 21, 3/5. This point in my life, it seems that they were kids. 11,645 were younger than 20. 5 of those killed were only 16 years old. And the oldest killed was 62 years old. And the estimates are that there are still 1,800 Americans unaccounted for from Vietnam. The special motive which brings me here today is that I grew up in the 1960s and with the war. I was a child in grade school. And as I'm sure we're all aware, what happens to you in childhood stays with you the rest of your life. So these memories are very, very fresh and vivid, even after the passage of many decades. First and foremost, I remember the casualty figures announced every week on the nightly news. It may be hard to believe or remember, there were only 3 networks in those days. 3 major channels, 30 minutes of news. The roll and toll of casualty figures. So many were killed last week, so many were wounded, was relentless and numbing. Over time, as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, it seemed to me that the war would never end, that this would go on and on and on. I remember the televised draft. I remember the anticipation and anxiety, although I didn't know what it was all about. I heard something about the fact that if your number was low, it wasn't good. If your number was higher, it might be better. And so I paid attention to my birthday and my number, like a child not really understanding the implications of what I was thinking about. I remember my parents and my uncle. All 3 were veterans of World War II. I remember, without their ever directly discussing with me, that they were upset. They were bewildered. But they didn't know exactly what seemed to be out of place or wrong. They didn't understand the protests on college campuses and in the streets. That wasn't part of their experience. But I noticed that they were not quick to condemn those protests either. Over time, they shrank from war news. They were exhausted. They had had enough. I certainly remember 1968, the Tet Offensive, the Pueblo incident. The images blurry in my mind, even more so than the ones on television, of the convention in Chicago, and as we said, cops and kids fighting in the streets. Assassinations, the things seeming to come apart. And I remember thinking, what was next? Could things get worse? Then I remember Christmas 1968, a family gathering, more solemn, perhaps, than other occasions. I remember watching Apollo 8, the first Apollo mission to orbit the moon. But there wasn't the sense of excitement and joy that, looking back, I would attribute later. I think the adults were just tired. I remember the 1972 election and Henry Kissinger saying, "We believe peace is at hand in Vietnam." But it wasn't. There were the Christmas bombings. I was sure that the war would go on forever. Even as an 8-year-old child, I felt lost and sad. And then President Nixon, going on television at the end of 1973, January, and announcing the Paris Peace Accords. I literally could not believe it. I could not remember a time when Vietnam was not part of our daily lives and constantly on our lips. 50 years have passed, but the memories remained fresh. And now, across these decades, looking at the Americans who served, thinking of the precious lives that were lost, the occasional consternation of the nation. In the end, I think of gratitude. I think of what was nobly done and intended. And I think that is how I will remember Vietnam for the rest of my life. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today on Feelin Good. I'd say today we're feeling grateful for the service of the veterans and for the Paris Peace Accords that brought the Vietnam War to an end. And as you can see in the background, we thank Miami University, the Middletown campus, for sponsoring this commemoration, the 50th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords. We hope that you're feeling good and you're feeling grateful. Bye for now.